Hey everyone, so we've been chatting about contradictions in the Bible, and you know who's always stirring the pot? Bart Ehrman, every skeptic's favorite scholar. This guy loves nothing more than challenging Christian beliefs by poking holes in the Bible's consistency. But here's the thing. Ehrman's arguments are often as flimsy as a wet noodle. He cherry-picks examples, exaggerates things, and conveniently ignores facts that don't fit his narrative. So if you want to catch up on all the drama, be sure to check out the playlist. Now, get this, Ehrman even claims that Paul's theology is so all over the place that later Christians must have forged letters in his name. He even goes further, suggesting that the book of Acts totally misrepresents Paul's message. But hold on, are his claims really as solid as he makes them out to be? Let's dive in and find out. In this particular video, we'll expose how Ehrman manufactures theological conflicts out of thin air. Ehrman says on his blog, in Acts 17, when Paul is preaching to the pagans of Athens, he tells them that they worship idols out of ignorance. They simply don't know any better. And because of that, God overlooks their mistake, but now he gives them a chance to recognize the truth and worship him alone. That stands in sharp contrast with the views that Paul himself lays out in the letter to the Romans. In chapter 1, Paul states his views of pagan idolatry and false worship, and they are completely contrary to what he allegedly said in Acts 17. In Romans, Paul tells us that pagans worship idols precisely because they know that there was only one God who was to be worshipped, and they rejected that knowledge in full consciousness of what they were doing. And because of that, God has cast his wrath down upon them. Well, which is it? Do they commit idolatry out of pure ignorance so God overlooks their mistake? Or are they fully aware of what they're doing so God judges them? Assuming Paul himself knew what his own views were, you would have to say that Acts has misrepresented the very core of his preaching message. Hey, hold up a second, Ehrman. It seems like you're totally missing the point here. Paul is not trying to say that the Athenians worship idols all because they don't know any better. He's focusing on their altar to the unknown God and using their own words to open their minds to the one true God. Paul says that God overlooks their times of ignorance, but that's hardly a compliment, especially considering how many Greek philosophers stress the importance of knowing God. Ehrman tries to make it seem like Acts and Romans contradict each other, but that's just a false argument. In Romans 1, Paul makes it very clear that no one can use ignorance as an excuse for idolatry because God's existence and nature are obvious in creation. But in other parts of Romans, like in his speech at the Areopagus, Paul emphasizes God's patience and mercy in the plan of salvation. Remember Romans 3:25? It says, "This was to show God's righteousness because in his divine forbearance he has passed over former sins." Let's not forget also that Paul's goal on Mars Hill was to win converts, not alienate his audience. Why would he start off by condemning their idolatry? And let's be real, there is a mountain of evidence that Luke traveled with Paul, so it would be weird if they had different theologies or that Luke misunderstood something. This supposed contradiction Bart's cooked up shouldn't make us question that fact. Now, let's talk about the pastoral epistles. Ehrman says they're forgeries and that they were written by somebody who had completely different theological beliefs than the real Paul, who wrote Romans, Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon. In his book Forged, Ehrman says, probably the biggest problem with accepting the pastorals is coming from Paul. The one thing that Paul does not do is to write to the leaders at the Church of Corinth and tell them to get their parishioners in order. Well, why is that? Because there were no leaders at the Church of Corinth. There were no bishops and deacons. There were no pastors. There was a group of individuals, each of whom had a gift of the Spirit in this brief time before the end came. Contrast that with what you have in the pastorals. Here you do not have individuals endowed by the Spirit working together to form the community. You have the pastors, Timothy and Titus. You have the church leaders, bishops and deacons. You have hierarchy, structure, organization. That is to say, you have a different historical situation than you had in the days of Paul. But Ehrman's argument falls flat on its face. Paul's undisputed letters clearly mention overseers and deacons. He addresses the Philippians alongside Timothy, specifically acknowledging overseers and deacons. The term overseer and bishop are actually interchangeable here. They mean the same thing. Even in 1 Thessalonians, Paul implicitly references church leadership, urging the community to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you. He speaks of leadership gifts in Romans chapter 12 and even mentions Phoebe as a deacon in Romans 16:1. If this is Ehrman's strongest objection against the authenticity of the pastoral epistles, then frankly, it's really unimpressive. Ehrman tries to pull a similar stunt when arguing against the Pauline authorship of Ephesians. He says, "Here, as in Paul's authentic letters, we learn that believers were separated from God because of sin, but they have been made right with God exclusively through God's grace, not the result of works." But here, oddly, Paul includes himself as someone who, before coming to Christ, was carried away by the passions of the flesh, doing the will of the flesh and the senses. This doesn't sound like the Paul of the Undisputed Letters, who says he's been blameless with respect according to the righteousness of the law. But Ehrman's argument here is laughably weak. He conveniently forgets Romans 7, where Paul openly wrestles with his struggles with sin under the law. Just a taste of Paul's raw honesty. He says, "If it had not been for the law, I would have not known sin. Sin, seizing the opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. I have a desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. Wretched man that I am! Who will deliver me from this body of death?" By Ehrman's logic, we could claim that Philippians disproves the authenticity of Romans. But Ehrman, like most scholars, accepts it as authentic. This is just a small sampling of some of Ehrman's shenanigans. He tries to pull this differing theologies where there are none move all the time, and I have the receipts to prove it. This kind of weak evidence to prove forgery wouldn't hold up in court. So next time Ehrman tries to tell you that Paul's genuine letters have one theology and that the others are putting words in his mouth, pump the brakes and look at the actual passages for themselves. You'll likely find that he's nitpicking and making mountains out of molehills to make his case. That's it for now. We'll be looking at other kinds of contradictions, and eventually we'll even get to some more of the difficult ones that Bart brings up, so be sure to stay tuned.